Well, let's stay with the war in Ukraine and get a US perspective now. We can speak to Kurt Volker, who is a former US Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations under President Trump and a former US Ambassador to NATO. Ambassador Volker, thank you very much indeed for being with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Now, back in April, I think it was at the Globsec conference in Prague, you're quoted as having said that you didn't think peace in Ukraine was likely by the end of the year, but you didn't rule out the possibility of a ceasefire. Do correct me if we're misquoting you. But if that is correct, has your position changed at all?
No, I still hold by that position. So let's start with the idea of peace. Vladimir Putin has made clear that he does not believe Ukraine is a sovereign and independent state and that it is not a separate national identity. He believes Ukrainians are actually Russians. And so with that, there is no compromise. There's no possibility of peace. His goal is to eliminate Ukraine as a state and as a national identity. So I don't think we'll ever have a peace agreement. That being said, I think it is possible to get a ceasefire. I think you can convince both Putin and the Ukrainians, much easier, but you can convince Putin it is too costly to him and to Russia to try to continue this war. And so he could be compelled, really, to accept a ceasefire. If that's the case, and I think that could be, then we can all build on that ceasefire to build a more stable, lasting, but very tense standoff. What would cause Putin to come to that conclusion? I think the most important thing that he's going to be confronting is the finances of the state of Russia. They are low on foreign exchange reserves. They do not have a lot of money coming in from oil and gas sales, and that may be going down, especially if secondary sanctions are applied. So he may face a fiscal crisis. And then on the military front, he's losing a lot of soldiers and a lot of equipment. Now, he's also building more equipment and he's recruiting more soldiers, but he's losing a lot. And so it may be that by the end of this year, he would like to see a ceasefire.
Right. And you just touched on what I was going to ask you next, which is about this economic Achilles heel. I mean, you mentioned a couple of indicators there, another couple of economic indicators that are flashing red in Russia. Q1 GDP is down very sharply, down to, I think, 1.4%. Manufacturing activity declining, consumers tightening their belts. I saw that car sales were down 30% in June year on year. Inflation is high, there's a recession looming, and the budget is strained. I mean, it could be, yes, couldn't it, that if current sanctions, I mean, you seem to be suggesting perhaps they're not adequate, but if they were cranked up a bit, I mean, could this be the way to end the war?
I think, again, to get to a ceasefire, yes, I think that is the way to go. All of the indicators you just mentioned are indeed out there. They're real. They're flashing lights. Just last week, there was an economic conference in St. Petersburg where the head of the National Bank was talking about some of these indicators, and President Putin felt he had to step in and say, well, actually, things may be a little bit worse, but we are taking measures to deal with it. So even Putin was acknowledging that they are facing some of these issues. And if you're a consumer, okay, maybe Putin doesn't care about you that much, but your means are going to be really limited by inflation. And that is a corrosive thing over time. And the official estimates of inflation perhaps are 11 to 13%. I think the real number is much higher.
Yeah, I mean, some suggesting it could be as high as 20%.
Yes.
And yeah, it was the finance minister by the name of Anton Siluanov who called the situation, the fiscal situation, a perfect storm. I mean, in this context, isn't there the ability for the US and Ukraine's other allies to deliver a knockout blow?
Well, there certainly is the opportunity to step up the sanctions. I think what is called for are secondary sanctions. That is to say, anyone who is taking part in helping Russia evade the existing sanctions, banning the sale of oil and gas and financial transactions to pay for it. If we did that and enforced it, I think it really would have a very significant effect on Russia's state budget.
Okay, since President Trump returned to office in January, I mean, has anything been achieved with regards to bringing this war to an end? Any steps in that direction? And has President Putin shifted an inch?
Yeah, I think that there have been. I think that he has aligned the United States and Ukraine in terms of policy goals. where Ukraine is now agreeing that there can be an immediate ceasefire in place. Prior to that, they would have wanted to retake territory. And President Trump didn't want to support the continuation of the war and to have American weapons used to continue the war, but for Ukraine to be able to defend itself if Russia continues. He seems to have achieved that with President Zelensky. He and Trump now agree on the idea of an immediate ceasefire. Second, President Trump came into office promising not to use any more American taxpayer dollars to support Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that we cut Ukraine off. It just means that assistance has to be paid for. And here again, they've now reached a deal on access to Ukraine's natural resources to create a redevelopment fund, which can be collateralized as a way of paying for this assistance. In addition, the U.S. can let Ukraine borrow money, or the European Union could lend money to Ukraine. So as long as Ukraine is able to pay its own way, then weapons flows to Ukraine can continue. And that's something else that I think has now been put into alignment. The piece of the plan that has not worked is getting Putin to agree to a ceasefire. And that is where, as we just discussed, I think more pressure is needed on Putin to try to push him in that direction.
Right, so when President Trump says he's not happy with President Putin and used a couple of strong words, as he tends to do at the moment, when he's unhappy about things, I mean, do you see this as being a mere mood swing by President Trump, or do you see this as part of a broader strategy?
It's a little of both, I guess I would say. There's definitely a mood swing because he has tried. President Trump has really bent over backwards to give opportunities to Putin, to give offers to Putin, enticements that would get him to agree to a ceasefire. And Putin has rejected him on every occasion. And I think that has soured Trump's mood. He's very frustrated with Putin right now. In addition to that, I think Trump knows he's choosing those words, those salacious words you highlight, carefully, in the sense that he wants to demonstrate his displeasure to see whether that can also motivate Putin. But the reality, as I see it, is that Putin only responds to force, only responds to tough actions. And that's what Trump is going to have to do to get any attention from Putin at all.
Okay, and of course he might respond, might he not, to a collapsing economy?
Well, that's right. And that would be caused by the types of tougher sanctions that we just discussed. He may not have a choice if he wants to preserve the Russian state to actually call for a ceasefire, because otherwise it runs the risk of unraveling the state's finances for its own preservation.
Do you think President Trump's going to send those Patriot missiles? And is he going to send enough of them to make a significant difference?
Yeah, well, yes, he will send Patriot missiles or move Patriot missile batteries. He's encouraged Germany and perhaps others to do so as well. Numbers are an issue because production of Patriots is not happening fast enough to cover the demand that Ukraine has, as well as other countries around the world have. So it's difficult to get the sufficient numbers. But there need to be Patriots because in certain types of incoming weapons, the caliber missiles, for example, Patriot is really the only system that's effective. On the Shahed drones, the Iranian drones that Russia sends into Ukraine, other systems can take those out. But for certain systems, the Patriots are really necessary.
Right, and they're really expensive. They're $1 billion for one battery. I mean, that's a huge amount of money. The German Chancellor had a clever idea. Friedrich Merz said that perhaps Germany could buy Patriot missiles from the United States and then deliver them to Ukraine. That would be quite a big win, wouldn't it, for the Trump administration? Something as well for him to show his support base.
Yeah, there's nothing to say that that should not happen. It is a good thing for Germany to do that. The question will come down to numbers, just how many Patriot missiles and systems are available. Because we do have this queue of countries that have lined up for production. If you were to make a new order for Patriot missiles now, you might be waiting 7 to 9 years to get those missiles. So in order to increase the numbers going to Ukraine, you're talking about either bumping Ukraine up in the queue, or you're talking about redeploying systems that are already deployed elsewhere. And that is what I think Trump has in mind. And yes, indeed, Germany could help with that, including by sending some of its own Patriots.
Right. I mean, there's one of the surprising developments in the last couple of days, and I just wanted to ask you what you thought of this, was the announcement of the suspension of military aid to Ukraine that was signed off on by the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. And then when asked about it a couple of days ago, President Trump said he didn't know anything about it. Were you surprised that the president's sort of not really in the loop with regards to important decisions like this?
I don't think the president was not in the loop. I think he didn't want to publicly criticize the Secretary of Defense or Undersecretary of Defense, just didn't want to get dragged down that road in answering questions. But he saw what happened and he corrected it. And I think that's what matters.
You are, of course, in Rome right now, and that's where, amongst other things that are happening, this coalition of the willing is holding talks, 31 nations, reconstruction efforts for Ukraine under discussion as well there. I'm just wondering whether there's a potential win here for President Trump as well, a bit like with NATO, where he got leaders to commit to a higher percentage of GDP on defense spend, whether he could perhaps get leaders there to somehow commit to, or the envoy from the United States could get those leaders to commit to greater spending in the war effort for Ukraine. I mean, do you think there could be something like that in the offing?
Yeah, I think so. I think, as you pointed out, the NATO summit was a big win for Trump, getting allies to commit to 5% of GDP for defense spending, 3.5% of that in hard defense budgets, and 1.5% in related spending. Getting some of that now committed to support Ukraine so that it rebalances the level of military support for Ukraine, that is quite possible, and that's beneficial. But you mentioned this coalition of the willing, and a major part of that is the idea of security assurances for Ukraine going forward once there is a ceasefire. And that is tremendously important, because if there is a ceasefire, as I said, I don't think we'll ever have a peace agreement. So we need to make that ceasefire as permanent as possible. And having European nations step up with security assurances and aid for Ukraine is critical to that. The other thing happening here in Rome is the Ukraine Economic Recovery Conference, which is now the fourth in a row after Russia's full-scale invasion. And it is important that if there is a ceasefire, the international community is positioned to move quickly to help Ukraine recover, rebuild, allow people to move home, get people back to work, strengthen the economy so the tax base is strengthened. All of those things need to happen, and they need to happen fast when there's a ceasefire. And the best way to do that would be for this Ukraine Economic Recovery Conference to establish a permanent body, maybe put a former European prime minister in charge, but a body that is focused day to day on trying to problem solve. How do you remove the obstacles to business investment in Ukraine that would power a rebuilding of the economy?
Okay, just lastly, I mean, it seems that President Zelensky has found his groove when it comes to how to deal with President Trump. We're told that a telephone conversation between the two men on Friday was their best conversation to date. I mean, that sounds pretty encouraging. What does President Zelensky need to get right, in your experience of dealing with President Trump, in order to make sure he's fully on side and fully on board?
Yeah, well, we've all seen some of the mistakes that President Zelensky has made in dealing with President Trump in the past. So not embarrassing President Trump publicly or criticizing him publicly, that doesn't go over very well. Instead of asking for weapons to win the war or asking for weapons to push Russia back, ask for weapons to defend civilians, defend people, and to recommit every time to a ceasefire that Ukraine wants peace, and it's really Russia that does not. Just getting some of that messaging right so it aligns with what Trump is trying to do makes for a much better conversation with President Trump.
And just absolutely my last question, in a word, really. If relations between Zelensky and Trump were at zero in February during that world-famous encounter in the Oval Office, on the scale of 1 to 10, where are they now?
Well, it's one of those things that it's interesting you put it on a scale, because I think it does move. I think that his relationship with Zelensky a few years ago was quite good. There was a little bit of friction during the presidential campaign. It hit a low point, as you said, at that Oval Office meeting. It has rebounded a lot since then. Remember, they met here at the Vatican in Rome at the Vatican on the margins of the funeral for the Pope. They met again after that on the margins of the NATO summit. They just spoke again now. So I think their relations are in a much firmer place again. Who knows how to assign a number to that, but it's not 10, but it's certainly more than 5.
Sounds like a 7 or an 8 to me. Well, thank you very much indeed. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Kurt Volker, thank you for your time.